Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the York Civil War Roundtable. My name is Adam Benson. I am the Assistant Director of Library and Archives in the History Center. We are very happy to host the Civil War Roundtable this evening. Here we are on October 20th, 2021. As always, we'd like to recognize Kathy Friel, the Program Director, and Scott Mingus and Scott Rosenau, the Assistant Program Directors. I believe they are out there in the internet land watching us tonight. But Kathy asked me to recognize the fact that tonight is the 14th anniversary of our partnership with the Roundtable. It actually started the Roundtable started back in 2005, but in October 2007, the Roundtable came to the History Center, which in those days was known as the York County Heritage Trust, for the very first time. So Kathy worked for many years with Lila Foreman Shaw, who's deeply, deeply missed, but we're happy to continue that partnership today. So if everybody's willing to bear with a few coming attractions, if you can get through those with me, then we will definitely begin our program as soon as we can. Let's see if I can advance this slide. There we go. All right, so we had so many events that I had to break them up into separate slides. So starting in the month of October, which is nearly over, but still we have a bunch of events coming up. Wow. This coming Tuesday, October 26th at 11 o'clock in the morning, we're having another in our series of early American cooking demonstrations. This takes place at our Colonial Complex on Pershing and West Market Street. And it's hosted by Christine Cooper, who's our manager of public programs. And she's presenting stewed meat. So it sounds interesting. Actually, when I first read that today, I thought that would be great to have for dinner, but didn't work out that way. So moving on to the 27th, a week from tonight, our All Vets program, which begins at 7 o'clock, just like the Roundtable does. And All Vets will be hosting Don Schaefer, who was a member of the Seabees, the Navy Construction Battalion, in the Vietnam conflict. On October 28th, next Thursday, I should say, Scott Mingus will be hosting a guided tour on the Underground Railroad in York County. And this is a ticketed event. And the registration for this event is actually due on Friday, the 22nd. So if you're interested in going with Scott to tour some historic sites in York County, probably many unknown sites, unless you've read some of his books, please check our website and get your registration in by Friday. Also on Friday I'm sorry, am I getting my dates right here? Today's the 20th, 21st. No, next Thursday evening. Sorry about that. The 28th at 7 o'clock p.m., a webinar, History of the Smith-Putnam Wind Turbine, presented by Dr. James Manuel of the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Many of you out there are probably aware that York County's S. Morgan Smith Company partnered with a few other firms in the production of the first wind turbine designed to generate electricity by wind power. It took place back in the early 1940s, right at the same time as we were gearing up for World War II. We have a lot of things coming out about that. We had a journal article that came out this year about the wind turbine. We also have an online exhibit that literally just went up on the website this week. But we're happy to feature this presentation, which is actually commemorating the 80th anniversary of the wind turbine beginning in 1941. So like I said, that presentation will be at 7 o'clock on October 28th. Moving into the month of November, November 7th. This is Sunday, November 7th, taking place at 1 p.m. in the afternoon. Ride the Rails with Abraham Lincoln. This is a York County History Center Friends event. I understand the tickets are limited for this, but I believe there are still some available. Please check our website for more information to see if there are tickets available for that event. And in the spirit of always making sure we've got lots of events on the same day, also on November 7th, the South Central Pennsylvania Genealogical Society will be meeting at the History Center at 2:30 in the afternoon. And we'll be featuring one of the busiest people in the county, Scott Mingus, who will be presenting the churches and chaplains of York County during the Civil War. So you can't get anything that is more on point for this group than that. So again, you can attend that in person or on Zoom. So please remember that upcoming event. Moving on to November 9th, that if my dates are correct, November 9th will be Tuesday evening. This is part of a week-long, what we're calling a history consortium, which is made up of historical societies from several different counties, Cumberland County, Adams County, York, obviously, and some Northern Maryland counties. Organizations are participating in this. And all week, beginning on the 8th and running 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12, running from the 8th through the 12th, each night we're going to be having a presentation about some aspect of local railroads. So check our website. We've got lots of details about each one of those. And I'm informed that this history consortium on railroads will be taking place on Facebook. So it'll be live streamed to Facebook if you're not able to make any of the in-person events. Just to point out that the History Center will be hosting our own part of this event on November 9th at 7 p.m. The presentation is entitled Rails to York, and it's presented by Tina Charles and Samantha Dorm. They'll be talking about the role that the railroad industry played in drawing African Americans to the York County area and to the city in particular. So please remember that event. Then on November 13th, our second Saturday lecture, which starts at 10:30 in the morning, will be featuring Tracy Lawson, who will be talking about using family lore as the basis for a historical novel. This is an in-person and Zoom event. That's November 13th. And once again, on the same day, November 13th is our History Center commemoration of the Articles of Confederation, which of course were approved by the Continental Congress when they were staying here in York. That event runs for most of the day, starting at 10 o'clock in the morning and running until 3 p.m. in the afternoon. There are lots of different events. Some of them are timed. So it's good to check those details out. We'll also have lots and lots of demonstrations and things for the entire family to keep you interested. So we're happy to do this again. I think we really had to tone it down last year, but we are planning on returning to a lot of the same programming that we have offered in previous years. So that is on Saturday, November 13th. All right. And then on November 17th, our next York Civil War Roundtable program, that's at 7 o'clock p.m. This will be on Zoom, just as we are tonight. And we'll be welcoming Michael Jessberger, who will be presenting something a little bit early, just before the holiday season kicks off, A Soldier's Civil War Christmas. This presentation, accompanied by a slideshow, discusses the experiences of the Civil War soldier during the Christmas seasons of 1861 through 65. Away from home, soldiers celebrated the season in different ways together in camp, on the march, and on the battlefield. The program will also discuss how Christmas was celebrated in the Civil War period on the home front and the many differences in relation to how the holiday is celebrated today. Come join historical reenactor, lecturer, and tour guide Michael Jessberger for a discussion of one of our favorite holidays and traditions. So that will be in roughly 4 weeks from tonight, the third Wednesday evening in November. So I am very happy to introduce tonight's speaker, Leon S. Reed, and he is a retired congressional aide and history teacher. He lives in Gettysburg, not too far from us, where he volunteers at the Visitor Center, explores the park, and writes and edits history books. He has written 3 photo books on Gettysburg monuments, a children's book about Jenny Wade, and the book on which his presentation tonight is based. no greater calamity for the country, North-South conflict, secession, and the onset of civil war. And without further ado, I present Mr. Reed.
Okay, thank you very much. There's my screen, there's my presentation. There's the slideshow, and of course I'm not at the beginning, so I'll back up. Okay, thank you. The title is a bit of a mouthful. Basically, I'll discuss the coming of the Civil War, not going back, for example, to the 3/5 Compromise. Really, I start pretty much with the 1860 election. This project, I had fallen to my lap, an unbelievable resource. I had a cousin who I went through high school with. He's also Reed, so we sat next to each other at graduation. When graduation was over, we shook hands and said, "Have a great summer," and didn't have any contact with each other for probably 45 years. At which point we got back in touch and have become very close. At some point, he said to me, "You're really interested in this Civil War. Would you be interested in seeing a scrapbook that an ancestor of mine put together?" At the time, he was the corresponding secretary of the New York Militia Association. I recovered my composure and said, yeah, I really would be interested in seeing that. The cover is shown in the upper right corner. This is an incredible thing. Hiram Rusa assembled the collection. He was very well positioned as the corresponding secretary, and he was an avid collector. Lots of soldiers from New York militia units sent him souvenirs. There are newspaper articles, there are original photographs, there's a lot of original correspondence, a letter from Robert Anderson written from inside Fort Sumter to Rusa. Lots of interesting things. For the purposes of this discussion, the most interesting part of the collection, something I wasn't aware was a thing, more than 300 absolutely mint condition patriotic envelopes. Just a quick overview, some of the oddball things. Maybe the oddest, President's Proclamation of Amnesty, Pardon and Amnesty, written in the Cherokee language, an 1832 document. The Rondout Guards, that's Kingston, New York, which is where Rusa was from. A lot of correspondence and articles relating to Rusa's hometown regiment, the 20th New York State Militia, the Ulster Guard. Patriotic envelopes. Again, I was not aware these were a thing. I've since immersed myself pretty deeply into the genre. They were popular ways to support the cause. I mean, they literally were envelopes that had some kind of illustration like this, usually one corner of the envelope, sometimes taking up the whole front. Patriotic statements, praise for current heroes, celebration of fallen martyrs, trash talk about the other side. Obviously, there were fewer printers in the South. Many Northern printers produced a Southern line for sale in the South. As I started absorbing them, at first I just thought these are really very cool. As I immersed myself more and more and realized the scope of coverage of these, I said, gee, these would be the illustrations for a really neat historical summary of the beginning of the Civil War. They are actually, from our perspective, historical documents. They tell a story. In the absence of public opinion polls, I won't say they're a good proxy for a public opinion poll, but they give us some idea what was on the public's mind. Obviously, they're produced by printers who are printing things to make money. If there's a third or fourth cover envelope on a particular topic, you can figure the first couple sold. This is an interesting quote on the theme from the magazine of the Stamp Collectors Society from early in the 20th century. Excellent idea, the temper of the people of that day. Extravagant and ridiculous drawing certainly is true. Before we get to the story, just a couple of notes. Probably half the envelopes were simply hooray for us, go team, go type messages. Very different approach, the North and the South. This is a good sample of the hooray for us covers of the North. Red, white, and blue. Nationalist heroes, George Washington, Andrew Jackson, Daniel Webster also. The Constitution, nationalist symbols, the laws. The message is the Union is permanent and unalterable. I don't think it will surprise anybody to know that the Confederates' message was not that the Union is permanent and unalterable. They also called back to authorities of our founding fathers, but they called back to the Declaration of Independence for obvious reasons. The right of the people to alter or abolish a government when it becomes oppressive. You'll note they too used George Washington, but not as a nationalist symbol, but as a rebel. Ever ready with our lives and fortunes. The last line of the Declaration of Independence, we pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. So that would be an unmistakable reference to that. Don't tread on us. Obviously, the Ben Franklin Join or Die cartoon, repurposed for secession and celebration of the founding of the Confederate States of America. So the 1860 election, I'm sure everybody knows the story. Certainly the most consequential election in our history. Intense interest, second highest turnout ever, percentage-wise. Oddly, 1876, the Hayes-Tilden race was the highest. Wound up being 4 candidates for president. The Democratic Party shattered, and factions of the party nominated. The regulars nominated sitting U.S. Senator Stephen Douglas. The militants nominated the sitting Vice President John C. Breckinridge. And the Southern Unionists nominated John Bell. The fire eaters warned all year, first Seward, then Lincoln. If you nominate a Black Republican, someone they considered a hardcore abolitionist, the consequences will be severe. Lincoln received less than 40% of the popular vote, but was an easy electoral college winner. This period from the beginning of the 1860 campaign, the next 12 months, not just the fact that the Civil War started. This has to be one of the most consequential 12-month periods ever. Of course, we saw one of our political parties shatter. They lost, they racked up the longest presidential losing streak ever and lost 11 of the next 13 presidential elections. The worst catastrophe in the country's history commenced in that period. The losses, killed, widowed, orphaned, maimed, would be the equivalent of us losing 17 million people since 2017. It obviously is still a dominant influence in our politics and culture. Often overlooked, largely due to the absence of the Southern Democrats who had seceded, Lincoln pretty much got his way legislatively. And a lot of long-term Republican agenda was enacted into law. Really created the impetus to finish settling the West, the Homestead Act, the Morrill Act, Pacific Railroad Act, and in a real sense created the outlines of the modern economy. Obviously, it led to massive growth of industry, population, etc. The move to international power came out of the Civil War. A lot of my talk, I'm going to address the states that did not secede in the first round. Their votes in the presidential election, you'll see North Carolina, Arkansas, Maryland were the three border states that went for Breckinridge. This is sort of from most pro-Southern to most pro-Union. As you move to the right, there are more votes for Bell, more votes for Douglas. Interestingly, Missouri was a close call on secession, but of these states, the most pro-Union vote. Lincoln even got a fair number of votes in Missouri. Kentucky showed a very strong pro-Union stance with the two Unionists basically doubling Breckinridge's total. Maryland is a Southern state and voted that way. So the first round of secession, South Carolina went within a month. Her US senators both resigned within days of Lincoln's election, clearly signaling the direction things were going. Kentucky Senator John Crittenden briefly delayed things by trying to put a compromise effort together. The other 6 states were prevailed on to be patient, give it a try. The talks collapsed. The 6, basically the states along the Atlantic coast and Gulf from South Carolina to Texas, the rest of them after South Carolina left in a short order in January and February. A side note, every state was entitled to an allotment of arms from the War Department. Secretary of War Floyd hastened to make sure all those states got their allotment before they left the Union. The North reacted quite calmly, really, to the first round of secession. There were some who said depart in peace, not a lot. There were more, many of the abolitionists said good riddance. The dominant reaction was, these problems come up every 5 years. A lot of noise, a lot of upset. We always figure a way to solve the problem. We'll figure something out. The New York business establishment, there was considerable sympathy for Southern goals. Of course, they're economically totally intertwined with the cotton industry. There was an open letter written by the leaders of the New York business leaders saying, please be patient, let us have time to work something out. That sympathy, though, absolutely ended with secession. We agree your cause is just, but you have to stay part of the club and work it within the system. Secession and Civil War were not a done deal, even in November 1860. When you study the issue, it's amazing how many people on both sides of the proposition came to their decisions very, very late. I quote just a couple here. Those who remember the title, there's the title of the book, No Greater Calamity for the Country, a Robert E. Lee quote. Within a few months, he, of course, is appointed the commander of Virginia troops. On the other side, John Dix, who led I referred a minute ago, the New York effort to prevail on the Southerners, to give them time. We sympathize with your plight, but it's going to take time. Within a few months, he's formed what is basically the mobilization czar. He's become the senior major general of volunteers, and by that summer, he's arresting the Maryland legislature. A quick note, fire eaters and unionists. There were many unionists in the Deep South. The so-called Georgia Triumvirate is a lead example, who came to secession very late. Of the three, Howell Cobb, who was Buchanan's Treasury Secretary, resigned pretty much immediately to go support Georgia. Robert Toombs held on until the Crittenden Compromise collapsed. Alexander Stevenson, literally, when the Georgia secession resolution was put to a vote, he was making impassioned speeches against it. And then, of course, when Georgia voted to secede, he proposed the next item of business, which was all good citizens of Georgia, of course, will support the action of their state. The difference between unionists and fire eaters was tactics, not goals. They all agreed about the issues. They, for the most part, even agreed that there is a right to secede. Just the unionists felt we have a better chance working the issue within the system. In the border states, of course, almost by definition, they were all unionists. A big difference, though, some, my term, right or wrong unionists. Crittenden was one. You know, I'm a union man through and through. If Henry Clay had still been alive, he'd have been one. Most were conditional unionists. You know, we support the union, but if you make war on our Southern brethren, and we expect concessions, we expect you to keep working our problems. The political geography mattered. Kentucky, even though it's geographically considered a southern border state, was really a western state. It's more like Ohio and Indiana than Tennessee. Maryland was more like North Carolina and Virginia than Pennsylvania. Missouri is maybe a little bit like present day Pennsylvania, the big cities, and then otherwise the rural areas were even called Little Dixie. St. Louis was an industrial northern city like Pittsburgh or Cleveland. Heavy German immigrant population. First action following secession, in fact, in a lot of cases preceding secession, is dealing with federal property. This consisted largely of coastal defense forts, a few barracks, a few hospitals, customs houses in the port cities. At this time, this is all a polite thing. These facilities are usually defended by maybe a garrison of 30 men led by a captain. They're not going to defend against anybody. So the city or the state would demand they surrender. There would be stiff protest. The commander would be permitted to salute the flag and then march out in honor and be sent home. Key West and Fort Jefferson off the coast of Florida, you needed a big Navy to even think about them. Fort Pickens and Fort Monroe, turned out they got enough troops there to defend them adequately. Fort Sumter became the flashpoint. South Carolina told President Buchanan that you have to leave our property, but for now, we're really busy with a lot of other stuff. So for today, long as you don't reinforce yourself or build up the garrison, we won't push it for now. An increasingly tense standoff for 3 months. Buchanan, of course, wants nothing more than to get home to Lancaster. He's more than happy to have this drift and hand it off to Lincoln. Jefferson Davis has probably the longest to-do list in the world. He's happy to have nothing happen. In fact, he was concerned enough about the South Carolina hothead starting something, maybe the first act of national sovereignty. He informed the state of South Carolina that the Confederate States of America would be taking over military affairs in Charleston Harbor just to make sure nothing happened prematurely. Lincoln also was happy to take no action, but then Robert Anderson informs him he's running out of supplies. By the end of April, he'll have to surrender. What do you want me to do now, boss? The cabinet discusses this. They agree. They don't really want to start a civil war, but on the other hand, it's not tenable as almost their first act in office to surrender a fort that is a major national symbol without even putting up a fight. So they do put together a relief expedition. Everybody, of course, knows exactly where it's coming from, where it's going, and when it's arriving. Feverish negotiations between Beauregard and Anderson, trying to find a graceful way out before the fleet arrives. No such way is found. Beauregard opens fire. Anderson holds out for a day and a half and then surrenders. Interesting thing in Roos's collection is this handwritten note on Anderson and Fort Sumter. The North did not react calmly to the firing on Fort Sumter. They really, the North was totally aroused. Peace Democrats, who up until that moment considered Lincoln an unforgivable warmonger, including some people we're going to hear about in the Civil War, like Dan Sickles and Ben Butler, instantly were converted to support of the war effort. The North is galvanized into action. Lincoln calls for a 75,000 soldier volunteer army to suppress the rebellion. And of course, he puts a quota on every state in the Union. That includes, of course, states like Virginia, North Carolina, and Arkansas, which were absolutely outraged at first Lincoln's gall in calling for troops in the first place, but then daring to ask them for troops to suppress their Southern brethren. If you want some great reading, the letters written by the border state governors to Lincoln are just priceless. All of them very angry, some of them totally sarcastic. And of course, this precipitated, there were 8 slave states still in the Union. I talk about 7. Delaware was never in play. I don't think they even ever called a secession convention to talk about it. So it's really the 7 that matter. I think I'm writing a book titled Fort Sumter's Long Shadow. I'll know better in a month. Really 2 topics that were driven by Lincoln's call for troops. One is, can the North mobilize? Can we get troops to defend Washington? It's strongly believed that the Confederates are raising an army to swoop across the Potomac River, potentially kidnap Lincoln and his cabinet. All the support from the governors of Michigan and Indiana is great, but troops parading in Lansing don't defend the capital of the United States. You need troops in Washington, D.C. Massachusetts cobbled together 4 regiments overnight. There were a handful from Pennsylvania, but otherwise the mobilization effort for the first month basically is whatever New York can send, which puts Hiram Rusa right in the middle of things, my keeper of my scrapbook. Lincoln actually sent federal funds to a newly formed organization in New York, the Union Defense Committee, which for the first 6 weeks or so was a sort of mobilization czar, coordinating on a very broad basis, not just in the state of New York. The other question, and what I'm really going to spend much of the time talking about, I think is the critical question of the war. What will, I put it in quotes, I have trouble calling Arkansas a border state, but what will those 7 states do? If none of them join their Deep South brethren, I don't think we have a very interesting story. A 7-state Confederate States of America would have a very difficult time organizing a successful defense. A 14-state Confederate States of America, 11 gave the United States all they could handle. Add those others 3 and take their resources away from the Union. They may have the military advantage. Virginia, of course, was the most important by far. Nobody was wasting any energy hoping they'd stay. It was a foregone conclusion. They're gone. But practically, their location, the amount of industry, the important federal facilities, and also symbolic. Abe Lincoln was the 16th president. Up to that time, 7 of the 16 were born in Virginia, as were, obviously Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Mason, etc. You also have the matter of Robert E. Lee, not the most senior, but probably the most respected officer in the United States Army. His decision is going to influence the decision of many other Southerners. The box gives a quick summary of how things changed. Early April, 2/3 against secession. Later that month, 88-55 pro. Virtually all of the 55 are from the counties that subsequently became West Virginia. And by late May, when the popular vote was held, it was 80-20. 2 quick steps, impressive bit of coordination that the Virginia militia did. There were 3 crucial military facilities in Virginia: Fort Monroe, Gosport Navy Yard, and Harper's Ferry Arsenal. Fort Monroe, the Union just barely got of those 4 Massachusetts regiments, they sent 2 to Fort Monroe. And for now, Fort Monroe is secure. The Virginia militia moved on the other 2. The Union forces holding the facilities attempted to destroy the inventory and the production equipment. So they scuttled the ships, they burned the arsenal, etc. Totally ineffectual. Virtually everything was salvaged. The basis of the Southern armaments industry was the production equipment from Harper's Ferry that was shipped south. But they put those 2 efforts together within a couple of days after they voted to secede. Fort Monroe didn't fall. That was critical. Obviously, it was a base for the blockading fleets in the Atlantic and for any invasion forces thinking of moving toward Richmond or the Carolina coasts. Also, of course, a crucial episode. 3 slaves made their way to Fort Monroe. Benjamin Butler, who was not much of a general, but was a very clever guy. The standing orders were do not interfere with local institutions. That meant send the slaves back if they come to your lines. He finessed that by saying nothing about freeing slaves. He just said, they're contraband of war. They were being used to build fortifications, and I'm confiscating them, much as he would confiscate a cannon. The cabinet thought about that and wrote back and said, we remind you of the rule against interfering with local institutions, but any slaves that make their way to your lines, you may make use of them as you wish. And with that, slavery's days were numbered because the rush was on. North Carolina, maybe the best governor's letter to Lincoln: your dispatch is received, and if genuine, which its extraordinary character leads me to doubt. Your letter is so stupid, I doubt you wrote it. Of course, Ellis knew he wrote the letter. He wanted to express his scorn at Lincoln. Zebulon Vance, who would be governor most of the war, an ardent Unionist, told the story years later that he was quite literally giving a speech against secession and had just raised his arm when the word came of Lincoln's call for volunteers. And as he says, when my hand came down from that gesticulation, it fell slowly and sadly by the side of a secessionist. Again, in February, there weren't even enough votes to call a convention. In May, it was unanimous. Arkansas, a similar story. They're the one who wrote a secession ordinance. The Deep South states mentioned slavery. Arkansas mentioned coercion as their reason for leaving the Union. Tennessee was the last to secede. I love this envelope. The Fox JD and the Skull and Crossbones, which is a common theme they used with Davis. Taking the dead birds, Tennessee and Virginia to Dixie's land. Tennessee politically was much like Virginia and North Carolina. The mountainous regions were extremely pro-Union. In Tennessee, it was sort of the mirror image. It went from east to west instead of west to east. The western part of the state was the plantation area. The eastern part of the middle part of the state was 50-50. But as it says here, when the ordinance was voted on, Middle Tennessee went from 51% against to 88% for secession. Eastern Tennessee remained unsettled territory, rebellious against the rebellion. It remained strongly pro-Union territory. And of course, a main war aim of Lincoln was to get troops to Eastern Tennessee to relieve the loyal Unionists there. Secessionist activities were not confined just to the sovereign states, Indian territory. As in most wars, the Indian tribes' view was which side is most likely to protect our tribal lands. Heavily divided, but more pro-Confederate. The Cherokee in particular, which were probably the largest tribe in Indian territory, furnished large numbers of troops to the Confederate Army, not just fighting in Indian territory, but they participated in battles like Wilson's Creek and Pea Ridge. And a footnote that the last Confederate general to surrender was a Cherokee Indian chief. I noted this before, but in Roos's collection, President's Proclamation of Pardon and Amnesty in the Cherokee language. Also, secessionist activities in New Mexico territory, that's New Mexico, Arizona, Southern Nevada. Basically, Texas has long considered this part of Texas. They mounted an invasion, which pretty easily took over the cities, but a corresponding group from Colorado eventually did push them back. Just of interest, because I recently noted their recent literature on the Confederate sort of might call Western strategy. A very interesting story. This book, The Three-Cornered War, has won a lot of awards recently. Kentucky, the first of the states that stayed. This was, I believe, a decision that reflected true public opinion. The governor was pro-secession, but the public elected a strongly unionist legislature. The militia was secessionist. Simon Bolivar Buckner, later a Confederate general, was the commander of the militia. Lincoln, just as he did in Missouri as well, just armed a pro-union militia. Henry Clay, of course, recently deceased, created a strong, the Union forever. I mean, his principles were union and compromise. His political tradition was strongly pro-union. There's little doubt in my mind that although there was a lot of political interference by Lincoln, that left to their own devices, Kentucky probably would have stayed in the Union. They initially adopted a stance of neutrality. The Confederates they sent troops into the state, which gave Ulysses S. Grant an excuse to also enter. He did more with his troops than the Confederate forces. The Kentucky legislature adopted a resolution saying the Confederate troops had to leave the state. But it was not really a theater of war. Its remainder, the Battle of Mill Spring early in 1862 really kind of pacified the state. Missouri is a state nobody will ever know what would have happened had nature been left to take its course. Profound level of interference here. The governor was strongly pro-secession, large planter class. St. Louis is pro-union. Key figure is Representative Frank Blair. He's the younger brother of Montgomery Blair, Lincoln's postmaster general and political consigliere. Blair has a direct line to the White House. If he sends a note saying, we need an aggressive young officer to take charge of affairs at the St. Louis Arsenal, Nathaniel Lyon shows up in a week or two. If he says, I need permission to arm the local militias, he gets permission to use the arms at the arsenal to arm 10,000 loyal citizens. Basically, Lyon and Franz Sigel, who probably had his best month of the entire Civil War before the shooting started, they were more aggressive. They struck on May 8th, arrested Jackson's militia. Jackson's militia is having an encampment, and they just moved in one night and arrested them. Later moved on to capture the state capitol, chased the secessionists away, and at the Battle of Boonville, more or less pacified the state. Missouri remained a bitter battleground the entire war. Lyon became, of course, the first Northern military hero, widely detested in the South. And he became the first Union general to fall at Wilson's Creek. There was a secessionist government of Missouri, but they were a government in exile most of the war. But the bushwhacking war in Missouri was brutal throughout the war. This brings us to Maryland. Maryland was the state that received more attention than any. It was the number one, we cannot allow this state to secede state. Deeply divided state. In this case, the city even had at least secessionist tendencies. The governor was pro-union. The mayor was sort of pro-secession. The police chief, who really ran the city, strong pro-secession. The militia leaders, obviously you recognize their names from Gettysburg. They were both important officers in the Army in Northern Virginia. So their sympathies are obvious. The point was made frequently by people in Maryland that we are very sympathetic to the concerns of the South. That's a long, long distance from ready to secede. We'll support our Southern brethren. That doesn't mean we're ready to join them. The Baltimore Sun eloquently made that statement a number of times. One of the first outbreaks of combat in the war, all troops coming from the Northeast have to pass through Baltimore, and there is not a continuous rail line through Baltimore. You have to navigate about a mile of city streets between the President Street station on the north side and the Camden station down where Orioles Park is now. On April 19th, by coincidence, the anniversary of Lexington and Concord, by coincidence, a Massachusetts regiment is passing down Pratt Street on this gauntlet and literally had to fight their way through Baltimore. This was not throwing rocks and bricks. This was a lineup and fire volleys thing. This was a real battle. I think there are a dozen people killed. Kane, the police chief, as I said, an ardent pro-secessionist, had utter contempt for these Yankee invaders, but he also recognized he had a job. And so he did organize his police to escort them through town, telling the roughs, the gangs, the people fighting them, hey boys, go home, come on, we got our job to do. That regiment got to Camden Station and made it to Washington. That night, the politicians communicated with Lincoln and said, no mas, no more troops through Baltimore. The militias took more direct action. Kane and Trimble led groups north who cut the telegraph lines and burned the railroad bridges. An alternate route by sea is developed to Annapolis, then a branch railroad line to meet the main line south of Baltimore. The first two regiments to arrive that way, the 7th New York, passed on to Washington and is really considered the regiment that made Washington secure. The 8th Massachusetts, commanded by Ben Butler, briefly occupied the city of Baltimore. And he was the first of several Union officials to declare martial law in Baltimore. Of course, there's going to be a crackdown. This cover General Scott, Governor Banks. Nathaniel Banks replaced Butler as the military governor of Maryland. Governor Banks, just chain up that dog Baltimore until he behaves himself. One of the banks in Baltimore that has not suspended operations. At one time or another over the course of the summer, the police chief was arrested, the police board was dissolved. Later, much of the state legislature was arrested. Lincoln decided Maryland will not be allowed to secede, whatever it takes. And I believe Maryland, left to its own devices, was not going to secede, but Lincoln was not in a mood to take chances. The mayor and the council wrote a protest letter to Congress. Liberty of citizens, constitutional rights denied. Congress wrote to Lincoln, please explain what you're doing here. Lincoln, it is judged to be incompatible with the public interest at this time to furnish the information called for by the resolution. Thank you for your interest in national defense. One envelope, the stars and stripes I hope will wave in Maryland, my Maryland, when every traitor's in his grave. Clearly an answer to the secessionist Maryland, my Maryland song. The despot seal is on thy shore, Maryland, my Maryland. Maryland remained pacified through the war, but Maryland did not remain quiet through the war. The protests were continuous. one intriguing cover, Fiat Justitia, turns out to be an ancient writ, sort of like a notary. In medieval times, a contract, a deed, a marriage license, nothing is legal unless the baron or the king has made his Fiat Justitia statement. Also a protest poem written by an anonymous lady of Baltimore. It goes on verse after verse after verse, protesting the political prisoners still being held in Fort Warren. The loss of freedom always sad to any is still more sad for you, whose native state is held in base subjection, etc. A final legal issue, ex parte Merriman. He was one of the bridge burners. A habeas corpus motion is made. He's been held without charge. This is often called a Supreme Court decision, but Chief Justice Taney was actually acting as a circuit court judge. He gave a resounding decision. The president does not have the authority to suspend habeas corpus under any circumstances. That's a legislative function. He ordered the release of Merriman. The Lincoln administration sent a colonel to the hearing. Taney said, "What? I don't see Mr. Merriman." And the colonel said, we don't really have any information for the court. I just came to tell you we don't have any information." Much like when Marshall made his decision about Indian rights and President Jackson said, "Mr. Marshall has made his decision. Now I'd like to see him enforce it." Significant number of arrests. Congress did finally pass an act regularizing the procedures. Sorry for the eye test. I wanted to get this all on one slide. The summary of all those secession actions led to a existing situation, facts of life on the ground. Where and when is this war going to take place? And other than this one, which is in Florida, you'll notice, it's an obvious enough statement. You're not going to attack Chattanooga at the beginning of the war. You've got to work your way there. The war started in these states. The fact that they left or stayed was significant in where early activities took place. Virginia, of course, takes the two facilities, Lyons Camp Jackson affair. Because Maryland didn't secede, Washington is tenable. It's an easy step across the Potomac River to occupy Northern Virginia. Obviously, we're going to pacify the western counties of Virginia. We're going to attempt to move inland from Fort Monroe and fight a battle at Big Bethel, etc. This is not a good record for the North, the South. Belmont, Butler's Hatteras campaign, and the early things in Missouri. Otherwise, things went really poorly for the Union in 1861. Turnaround quickly, early 1862 was almost all pro-Union. You had Fort Henry and Donelson, the collapse of New Orleans, etc. Burnside's Coastal Carolina campaign. By, say, May 1862, things were looking fairly bleak for the Confederacy. We all know how that turned out. So the bottom line, as I said, any state can change their mind. It was always conceivable that Kentucky would say, okay, that was enough, now we're leaving. Lincoln was concerned about that for at least the first 2 years of the war. But at least for now, the sides are chosen. And so are the initial battlefields. We know where they're going to be. The 4 states that seceded doubled the white population from the original 7. Important additions to all the economic factors of modern 19th century warfare, significantly shifted the border 100 to 300 miles north. And those 4 states furnished nearly half the Confederate Army. The 3 states plus Western Virginia denied even more resources. The white population of that area was larger than either of the original segments, 2.9. Of course, they lost the Port of Baltimore, St. Louis, etc. The border did not move those additional miles north. Had those states seceded, the border would have been the Mason-Dixon line and the Ohio River. Confederate States of America is 15 miles from Philadelphia, 1 mile from Cincinnati. Where does the national capital go? Lansing, not Philadelphia. What resources these of course are resources. I don't have a lot of use for what ifs, but these are resources deprived to the north and enhancing the south. The Chesapeake Bay is a Confederate lake, Port of Baltimore, St. Louis, Louisville, additional miles of those rivers. Military movements are much tougher for the Union, much more for them to conquer, much greater threat of a Southern invasion of the North. Economy, undoubtedly hundreds of thousands. Kentucky was like 3 to 1 soldiers fighting for the North versus the South. Of those 100,000 who fought for the North, you have to think a great number of them did that because their state had stayed with the North and had their state gone south. Many of those people would have enhanced the ranks of the Confederate Army. Washington, D.C. is almost certainly untenable. No easy conquest of Northern Virginia. Many important cities vulnerable, many more resources to defense. Really, the question is, would the start of the war been on to Philadelphia? I'm not highlighting this as a realistic possibility, more to make the point that when Lincoln said, I need to move heaven and earth to keep these states from leaving, the balance sheet says it would have been a real loss to the Union if those states had left. This is the presentation tonight is about half of the content of this book. I go somewhat deeper into the issues than I do in the book, which is a real survey. But I appreciate everybody's attention and would be happy to answer any questions. And I will now stop sharing.
All right. Well, thank you very much. A lot of interesting food for thought there. And I love seeing those various prints that you shared, ultimate primary sources. And I think a lot of that stuff from the early part of the war is not covered so much in the surveys.
No, you'll see a few used as an illustration randomly. I don't want to pretend to have delusions of grandeur. Bill Frazanito invented a whole new field of study, but he made the point that photos are not just illustrations, they're historic documents. And I feel on a smaller scale, obviously, they're not the cosmic importance of the photos, but I do believe these envelopes are an underappreciated historic resource.
All right. Well, this is the question and answer time. So if anybody has anything you'd like to ask, please feel free to put it into the chat window or into the Q&A function on Zoom, and we will get right to it. I'm going to switch over to Facebook and see if we have any comments there. We do have a comment from Scott Mingus. He said, fascinating collection, Leon. As a paper scientist by trade, I am always interested in talks about paper documents from the war years. So,
Good for Scott. Yeah. One, I made the point that if there's a lot of covers on a topic, it tells you at least there was interest. I mentioned briefly Butler and the Contraband. I find it greatly of interest that there were something like 50 different envelopes on that topic. Clearly the Northern public, you know, the sort of the received wisdom about the Civil War is, you know, the Northern public was, you know, by our standards, quite racist, hostile to freedmen. The war, until Lincoln wrote the Emancipation Proclamation, was about preserving the Union. One thing that just the number of covers tells me is the Northern public at least was intrigued about the notion of slaves running away, because the covers all were celebrating the contraband. So that's an interesting note that I had. Is the book available in the Gettysburg Visitor Center bookstore? No, it is available at the Heritage Center and at the Jenny Wade House. I have never been successful in penetrating event management and getting a book placed in the visitor center.
right. And there was the same question was on Facebook, but I think you answered it. So, all right.
That's my favorite question, by the way. Chris Mikowski did a written Q&A with me on this book for his ECW blog. And one of them was, what question do you wish people would ask you about the book? And I said, can I buy a copy? And then I came up with a serious answer as well. But as Scott knows, commerce is, we write our books because we hope people read them.
All right. Are there any additional questions out there? This is your chance. Well, it doesn't look like there are any at this point. I'm guessing, Leon, that you answered everything in such detail that everything is covered.
I
100%.
overwhelmed people with a blizzard of facts, if nothing else. Yeah. There are, let me tell one more story. Why did John Bell's card have traitor marked on it? Yeah. He did, while he sat the war out, he did not actively take a role in the cause, but he did make a speech late in the day, endorsing secession. And that envelope, the tiny little print on the left side of the picture, quotes him saying, again, it was, if Lincoln is going to coerce the South, we have to resist that. And then traitor superimposed on that. The vast majority of the envelopes are from the Northern perspective. And that became truer and truer as supplies became harder to come by in the South. Most of the envelopes with a Southern perspective were actually printed by Northern printers. You'll actually see the same image, one holding a Stars and Stripes and one holding a 7-star Confederate flag, obviously intended for sale North and South. The whole genre faded away by about the middle of 1862. I think just as the casualty lists mounted, it became less like, the Saturday afternoon college football game and more like serious business, and people just, the rah feeling kind of departed. One of the printers in the North also had a sideline printing counterfeit Confederate currency, which he sold large numbers of to cotton traders. I read actually an article in a journal on money supply that it was estimated that maybe as much as 5% of the circulating currency in the South was printed by Northern counterfeiters. So they played their part in debasing the Southern currency, which was pretty shaky to begin with. So an active bunch of entrepreneurs, always looking for an opportunity to make a buck.
That brings to mind the question of why that wasn't something that was officially encouraged on the part of the Union government. Maybe it couldn't be officially done. But
very well might have been. They certainly did everything they could to sabotage their purchasing program overseas, their diplomatic efforts overseas. Charles Francis Adams, I think, was the ambassador to England, and he had a very active intelligence staff that was basically staked out all the English shipyards. And if there was any indication of a ship being ordered by the Confederacy, they would present the documentation to the ministry and, a stiff letter of protest. They certainly were doing everything internationally they could to frustrate their efforts. And if they could cause rampant inflation, I'm sure they probably would have done that as well. One thing you come away from, considering the standing start they got, and the tradition, their formation as a states' rights country, you have to take your hat off the extent to which they actually managed to form a nation and form a defense industry, and sustain an army. This is off topic, but the talking about the diplomacy reminded, there's this mythology of the haggard, shoeless Confederate soldier. For the most part, they were pretty well supplied. They had horrible trouble with their artillery shells, their fusing, but starting from a standing start, they did a pretty impressive job of creating a government and a defense industry.
Given to the extent that it was kind of opposed,
especially
to the whole
since
theory.
so many of the governors, Joe Brown of Georgia, Zeb Vance of North Carolina, were not cooperative with the national government. They would hoard resources for home defense when, there's no Yankee troops within 500 miles of Georgia, and we need them in Virginia.
I do not see any additional questions on Zoom, and
Okay.
on Facebook. So I think we might be able to finish up for the evening.
Okay. Well, I appreciate everybody's attention. I appreciate the invitation. I always enjoy a chance to talk about my favorite topic.
Thank you very much for joining us tonight. It's certainly a topic that I did not know nearly as much about. And like I said, I'm fascinated by these primary sources that.
Good. I
yeah,
am
I think it's
one
great.
by one spreading the word.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for attending tonight. And our next presentation, I think I said November 17th, the third Wednesday evening in November. And please join us again for the York Civil War Roundtable. And thank you again, Mr. Reed. And have a great weekend, everybody.
Thank you.
Good night.